Episode 1. The Gift No One Asked For. I never believed wooden objects could breathe, but the first night I held that crucifix, I swore it inhaled the silence of my room, exhaled a chill that settled into my bones. The gift came from a forgotten monastery outside the village, a ruin where ivy strangled the stones and bats hung like shadows from broken rafters. An old monk pressed it into my hands without a word, his eyes hollow, as if relieved to finally let it go. It wasn't beautiful. The wood was cracked, the Christ figure worn smooth by centuries of touch. But something about it compelled me, like an artifact that had survived more confessions than the church itself. I carried it back to the parish, not knowing I was carrying a curse. That evening, I placed it on the wall of my study, above the desk where I prepared sermons. The candles flickered strangely, but I blamed the wind that slipped through the shutters. I was tired, my throat dry. So I whispered to myself, I'll write a homily tonight. But that was a lie. I had no intention of writing. And in that instant, the crucifix trembled. It wasn't the wall shaking. It wasn't my eyes playing tricks. The wooden body of Christ shivered ever so slightly, as if something alive pulsed within it. I froze. My first instinct was to laugh. Nerves, surely. Yet the longer I stared, the clearer it became. The crucifix moved not when the wind blew, but when the falsehood left my lips. I tested it. Tomorrow I will fast. Tremor. I forgive everyone in my parish. Another tremor, sharper. My chest tightened. I whispered the truth. I am tired. Nothing happened. I don't want to write. Silence. Only the lies stirred it. A strange thrill coursed through me, equal parts awe and terror. Was it a sign from God? A warning? Or had madness finally found me? I couldn't sleep. I carried the crucifix into my bedroom, half expecting it to glow or bleed. It remained still in the dark. But every time I thought of lying, even silently in my mind, I felt a tension in the wood, as though it knew. At dawn, I returned to the chapel. The morning light painted the pews in gold, but I saw them differently now. How many lies had been whispered in this place? How many secrets buried under false confessions? The crucifix seemed heavier in my hands, as though burdened by centuries of deceit. And then a thought struck me, a temptation I couldn't resist. What if I brought it into the confessional? What if I held it as my flock spoke their sins? Would it tremble? Would it expose them? I smiled despite the fear gnawing at my stomach. This was no ordinary relic. This was a judge carved in wood, a silent witness that refused to be fooled. I hung it in the chapel that morning. By noon, the first confession began, and when the penitent opened his mouth, I swear the crucifix trembled before he even spoke. Episode 2. The First Confession. The confessional had always been a place of shadows, wooden lattice, muffled whispers, the smell of incense clinging to every breath. But that day, when I carried the crucifix inside, it felt like I was dragging judgment itself into the narrow booth. I set it on the small shelf beside me, its presence immediate, oppressive. Even without movement, I sensed it listening. The chapel bells finished their ringing, and the first penitent entered. I recognized his shuffle, the hesitant footsteps of Matteo, a young farmer known for his nervous smile. He knelt, the screen separating us, and his voice quivered. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The words were ordinary, but the moment they left his mouth, the crucifix shuddered, a delicate vibration, subtle yet undeniable. My heart lurched. Was he lying already? "Go on," I whispered, though my throat was dry. He inhaled sharply. I have worked on the Sabbath. I did not keep the holy day." The crucifix trembled again, stronger this time, rattling against the wood. My palms dampened. It was as if the cross itself rejected his words. I leaned closer. "Matteo," I said quietly, "are you certain that is your sin?" Silence. On the other side of the screen, I heard his breath quicken, then a strangled sob. "No, Father, that is not my sin." The crucifix stilled. He broke then, words tumbling out like stones pulled from a well. He confessed to stealing from his neighbor, to betraying his wife with another woman in the village. Every admission poured out with shaking hands and tears, as though the truth burned on his tongue. And all the while, the crucifix remained still, utterly still. By the time he finished, he was weeping openly, whispering, "I would have never spoken these things aloud. but something in me knew I could not hide them today. I glanced at the trembling Christ carved in wood. My pulse thundered. It wasn't only me who felt its power. The crucifix had forced honesty out of him, stripping the mask of excuses, dragging his soul bare into the open. When Matteo left, pale but strangely relieved, I remained in the booth alone, the silence pressed down, heavy and suffocating. My fingers brushed the crucifix and I swore it pulsed faintly, like a living heart. Then a thought chilled me. If it trembled at the lies of my flock, what would it do when I lied? As the next penitent entered, the booth felt narrower, the air heavier. A woman's voice spoke through the screen, calm, practiced, rehearsed. I already knew the crucifix would not allow her to keep her script. I realized then, this was no gift. It was a mirror none of us asked to face. And in its reflection, there was nowhere to hide. Episode 3, The Whisper in the Chapel. Nights in the chapel had always been silent, holy, still, the kind of silence that pressed close to the skin like a prayer. But after the crucifix arrived, silence became impossible, because the silence wasn't empty anymore. It whispered. It began with faint murmurs at the edge of hearing, like breath seeping through the cracks of the confessional. At first, I told myself it was wind slipping beneath the doors, or rats scratching behind the altar. Yet no matter where I stood, the sound followed, a low, indistinct murmur as if the wood itself was muttering secrets. One night I stayed late, determined to prove my nerves wrong. The chapel was unlit, the moon spilling silver through stained glass, painting the floor with fractured saints. I sat in the front pew, the crucifix hanging just above the altar, still and unmoving. Then I heard it, clearer than before. Lie, lie, lie. The words slithered through the air like smoke, soft but undeniable. My heart hammered. I looked around, but the pews were empty. The doors bolted. I was alone, I whispered aloud. Just a test. I am not afraid. The crucifix quivered and the whisper hissed louder, almost mocking. Lie. I stumbled back, every nerve in my body screaming. The whispers were not random. They responded. The following nights grew worse. Whenever I entered the chapel, the murmurs rose, a chorus of unseen tongues reciting half-formed confessions. I heard names I recognized, sins not yet confessed, men and women of my parish, secrets they had never dared to speak. One night, I even heard my own name, Elias. That broke me. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the whispers seeped through bone and blood. They weren't coming from outside. They were blooming from within the crucifix. Desperate, I climbed the altar steps and seized the wooden cross. It burned cold against my palms, trembling faintly as though alive. The whispers surged into my head, no longer muffled. Every lie is written on me. Every lie, every shadow. I dropped it instantly. It hit the stone floor with a hollow crack, yet the figure of Christ continued to shiver, as if it were laughing. The chapel seemed to breathe. Candles, though unlit, flickered in my vision. Shadows crawled up the walls like living things. And then, stillness. No whisper, no sound. But silence no longer felt like silence. It was a pause, a breath held in the throat of something vast and unseen, waiting. That night I locked the chapel doors. I told myself it was to keep the relic safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't about protecting the crucifix, it was about keeping it inside. Because if those whispers ever spilled into the world beyond these walls, the lies of every soul would be dragged screaming into the open. And God help us when that happens. Episode 4, The Lie That Broke the Silence. It was Sunday when the silence finally shattered. The chapel was crowded, pews groaning beneath the weight of villagers. They came dressed in their best, their eyes lifted toward the altar where the crucifix hung. I could feel its presence before I even looked up, heavy, alert, like an executioner waiting for the guilty to step forward. I told myself the whispers were only for me, but that morning the air felt taut, expectant, as though the whole parish was about to hear them too. The Mass began smoothly. Hymns rose, incense curled. For a moment I thought perhaps the crucifix would remain still, granting me one blessed hour of peace. Then Father Corvus entered. He was older than me, a priest with silver hair and a reputation for stern piety, but I knew better. His pride was sharp, his ambition cruel. He had come to oversee my Mass that day, to remind me who held authority in the diocese. He mounted the pulpit, his voice booming through the chapel. "Brothers and sisters," he declared, Our Lord calls us to humility and purity. I stand before you with a heart free of stain, devoted only to the truth of God. The words had barely left his mouth when it happened. The crucifix convulsed, not a tremor this time, a violent shudder that rattled the chains securing it. The Christ figure quaked as though seized by unseen hands. A gasp rippled through the congregation. People turned, wide-eyed, clutching their rosaries. Father Corvus faltered, his eyes darting upward. The crucifix shook harder, groaning against the wood of the altar. Candles toppled, spilling wax like tears. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. This is some trick." But the crucifix knew, and so did I. The whispers swelled, not just in my ears, but in every ear present. 1,000 voices layered into one. Lie, lie, lie. The parishioners clutched their heads, some weeping, others shouting prayers. Father Corvus staggered back from the pulpit, his face pale as bone. And then, snap, the chain broke. The crucifix tore free from the wall, crashing to the ground with a thunderous crack. Splinters flew. The figure of Christ split down the middle. Yet even broken, the wood trembled, vibrating like a living heart torn from flesh. The church descended into chaos. Women screamed, men rushed for the doors. But I stood rooted, my gaze locked on Corvus. His lips moved soundlessly, sweat dripping down his face. He knew the lie that broke the silence was his own. I bent to lift the crucifix. Even shattered, it pulsed in my hands, cold as stone, yet alive as blood. And in that moment, I understood. It would not only judge small deceits whispered in confession. It would expose the proud, the powerful, the priests who hid their rot behind holy robes. And God help me, part of me wanted it to. Episode 5, The Blood That Wasn't His. After the crucifix split, nothing in the parish felt the same. The air itself seemed charged, like a storm crouched above the roof, waiting. People no longer entered the chapel with reverence. They entered with dread, glancing upward as though afraid the walls might betray them. But the crucifix had not finished its work. It began with a child. Little Samuel, no more than 10, was accused by a merchant of stealing a handful of coins from his stall. The boy stood trembling before the congregation after Mass, his thin hands clutching at his torn shirt. The merchant's voice thundered with righteous anger, demanding justice. I tried to intervene, to calm them, but the crowd pressed closer, their eyes flicking to the broken crucifix lying beside the altar. Some whispered that we should test the boy, see if the relic would tremble when he spoke. I resisted. God forgive me, I resisted. But the weight of their stares was heavier than my own conscience. I brought the child forward. "Samuel," I asked softly, "did you take the coins?" His lips quivered. "No, Father." And at once the crucifix began to shake. The congregation gasped. Some shouted, "Liar!" Others crossed themselves in horror. Samuel burst into tears, crying out, "I didn't! I swear I didn't!" But the crucifix did not stop. Its trembling grew violent, knocking against the stone, rattling like a bone caught in a predator's jaw. Then something worse. A drop of blood slid down from the wooden Christ's brow. It pattered onto the altar, dark and wet, though no wound marred the figure's face. The blood pooled, thick and slow, until the stone beneath it gleamed red. The crowd recoiled, some screaming, others falling to their knees. The merchant's face twisted between triumph and terror, but my eyes were fixed on Samuel. The boy looked up at me through his tears, and in his gaze I saw something unshakable. Truth. Whatever the crucifix claimed, I knew then he spoke honestly, and yet the blood kept falling. A thought struck me, chilling and merciless. What if the crucifix was not revealing his lie, but the merchant's? I turned to face the man. "You accuse him boldly," I said, my voice low. "But tell us, merchant, did you lose coins at all?" His jaw clenched. "Of course I—" The crucifix convulsed so violently it cracked the altar stone beneath it. Blood splashed across the floor, spattering his shoes. The crowd cried out, retreating in fear. The merchant stumbled back, his face white. His lips opened, but no sound came, because the truth had already been spoken without words. The boy had been innocent, and the blood that stained the chapel that day, it wasn't his. Episode 6, The Priest's Secret. For days after the blood incident, the parish would not speak of anything else. Mothers whispered as they fetched water. Men crossed themselves at the sight of the chapel's doors. They said the crucifix had turned into a judge, and no sinner could escape its trembling. But what they didn't know, what only I knew, was that the crucifix had begun to tremble, even when no one spoke at all. It began in the quiet hours, when I was alone in my study. I would be writing sermons or leafing through scripture, and from the corner of my eye I'd see it. The broken figure of Christ, trembling faintly atop my desk. At first, I thought it was the draft sneaking through the shutters or my weary imagination. But then I noticed a pattern. It always trembled when I entered the room. Once I placed it on the floor and stepped back. Stillness. The moment I drew near, just one step, the wood shivered violently, as though repulsed by my very breath. The realization struck like a blade. It was not reacting to lies anymore. It was reacting to me. I tried to dismiss it, but my heart betrayed me, because deep inside, buried beneath years of sermons and rituals, I carried a truth I had never confessed, not even to myself. I had lied every time I proclaimed my faith without doubt. I had lied every time I told my parishioners that my heart belonged wholly to God. The crucifix trembled because it could taste the rot in me. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the faint rattle of wood against stone. I lit candles and knelt before it, whispering prayers, but the trembling only grew stronger, almost furious. My words felt hollow in my mouth. Finally, I shouted, "What do you want from me?" The chapel answered with silence, and then, faintly, a whisper that seemed to crawl from the cracks of the crucifix itself. "Confess." I fell to my knees, trembling as hard as the wood. I do not believe you anymore," I gasped. "I stand before my flock and speak of heaven, yet I feel only emptiness. I preach of grace, but doubt coils in me like a serpent. My faith is a mask, and beneath it, I am nothing." The crucifix stilled. For a moment the air became unbearably heavy, pressing on my chest until I could not breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the trembling ceased. The figure of Christ lay quiet, its cracks glistening in the candlelight like open wounds. I should have felt relief, but instead terror settled deep in my bones. Because if the crucifix demanded my confession, then sooner or later it would demand the same from everyone. And when it did, no soul in this village would escape unscathed. Episode 7, The Night of Screams. The seventh night was when the crucifix found its voice. I had fallen asleep in the rectory with my cassock still on, exhaustion pulling me into a shallow, restless dream. But the sound that woke me was not the tolling of bells, nor the wind through the shutters. It was a low, metallic groan, like chains dragged across stone. I stumbled into the chapel with a lantern in hand. The air was suffocating, heavy with the odor of burnt wax, though no candle had been lit. The crucifix lay on the altar where I had left it, fractured but whole enough to hang together. Its body shook, tiny spasms running through the wood as if a heartbeat beneath the grain. Then it screamed, not in words, not in anything human. The sound tore through the chapel like iron shrieking against iron. A howl that split my skull and rattled the windows in their frames. I dropped the lantern, and its light rolled across the floor, throwing monstrous shadows against the walls. The pews creaked though no one sat in them. I swear I saw shapes there, blurred, half-formed figures with mouths wide open, screaming without sound, echoing the crucifix's terrible cry. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The scream was inside me, reverberating through my ribs, crawling into my bones. My knees buckled. I whispered prayers I barely remembered, stammering pleas for mercy. But the crucifix only shrieked louder, as though mocking every word. And then, silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a battlefield after slaughter. My breath trembled, my ears ringing. I lifted my head. The crucifix no longer trembled. It throbbed, a steady rhythm, like the pulse of a living creature. And beneath that rhythm, faint but unmistakable, came voices, dozens, hundreds. They whispered my name. "Elias, Elias." I staggered back, choking on fear. The shadows in the pews shifted, as if they had leaned forward all at once. I knew then that these were not visions, not dreams. The crucifix had become a beacon, drawing the unconfessed, the damned, the restless dead who had lied in life and never faced judgment, and they had come to scream through it. I fled. I confess it. I abandoned the chapel to its howling choir, slamming the heavy doors shut behind me. Even then, the wood quivered beneath my hands as though the screams clawed to be free. When the sun rose, the village gathered outside, drawn by the echoes that had spilled into the night. They asked me what had happened inside. Their eyes searched mine for answers. I opened my mouth to reassure them, to say it was nothing, to lie. But before I could speak, the crucifix inside shuddered once more, and the scream began again. Episode 8, The Woman Who Knew. By the time the 8th night came, the crucifix had already driven half the parish into hysteria. Some swore it was divine judgment, others whispered it was a curse from the devil. But none dared step too close. None, except for her. Her name was Isabella, an old widow, frail as parchment, with eyes that seemed to look through stone. She lived alone at the edge of the village, and the children whispered she prayed in ways that were not taught by the church. I had not seen her in the chapel for years. Yet one evening, long after the bells had ceased, I found her waiting in the pews. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on her lap, her gaze fixed on the trembling crucifix above the altar. "Father Elias," she said before I could speak, "you think it trembles, it lies." Her voice carried no fear, only certainty. I hesitated. "It has revealed much already. The wicked cannot speak falsehoods in its presence." She shook her head slowly. "No, Father, you misunderstand. It does not tremble at lies. It trembles at intent." The word hung heavy in the silence. "What do you mean?" I asked. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "A lie begins long before it is spoken. The moment a man decides to deceive, even in his thoughts, the crucifix feels it. It knows before the tongue ever moves." A chill rippled through me. I remembered the night it shook in my study. Before I had spoken a word, had it sensed the truth I dared not admit, the doubt festering in me? I stepped closer to her. "How do you know this?" She finally turned her gaze to me, and her eyes were like black glass, unblinking, endless, "Because it trembles whenever I pray." The confession struck me harder than a scream. My voice faltered. You lie in prayer?" She laughed softly, a sound brittle as dry leaves. "No, Father. I mean my prayers too much. I pray for things that cannot be holy." The crucifix above us shivered violently, as though affirming her words. The candles guttered, shadows leaping across the walls. "What do you pray for?" I whispered. Her answer came like a blade. "For God to reveal every secret in this village. For Him to tear the masks from their faces. For no one, no priest, no child, no soul to hide from what they truly are." The crucifix convulsed so violently that dust rained from the rafters. I staggered, covering my ears as whispers filled the chapel, hundreds of voices, confessions spilling into the air like smoke. When I looked back, Isabella was already walking down the aisle, her steps slow but certain, her shadow stretching unnaturally long across the stone. And in that moment I realized the crucifix was no longer just a relic. It had found an accomplice. Episode 9, The Unholy Mass. The church had never been so full. Word of the crucifix's scream had spread like fire, and though fear clung to every face, curiosity dragged them back into the pews. They came to witness, to judge, to tremble together. Some whispered of miracles, others of curses, but all eyes lifted to the altar where the fractured crucifix hung once more, patched crudely to the wall. I should have canceled the Mass. Every instinct urged me to close the doors, to silence the bells. Yet pride, and something darker, a compulsion I could not name, forced me to stand before them with the crucifix above my head. The hymns began. Voices rose, uneven, quivering. The incense filled the chapel with smoke that clung too thickly, a veil of gray that made saints painted in glass look like mourners. I opened the gospel. My hands shook, though I tried to steady them. The words were familiar, carved into me by years of repetition. But when I spoke, the crucifix began to tremble. "Blessed are the pure in heart." The wood shivered violently, rattling against the nails. "For they shall see God." The crucifix jolted as though struck, and the sound it made silenced the congregation. The words on the page blurred before my eyes. And then, with a horror I cannot explain, the letters shifted. They rearranged themselves into phrases that had never been written. "Blessed are the liars, for they shall see the abyss." My mouth froze. My tongue tried to form the holy words, but the air in my lungs carried only those twisted verses. I heard myself speaking blasphemies I did not intend, every line of scripture bent into mockery. The people gasped, some falling to their knees, others crying out, and yet none left. They were bound to their seats as though the crucifix itself held them captive. Children began to weep. An old man collapsed, clutching his chest, whispering, "This is not Mass, this is judgment." The crucifix convulsed harder, its splintered arms vibrating with a force that shook the rafters. Dust rained down like ash. From its cracks seeped a dark liquid. Not blood this time, but something thicker, black as oil. It dripped onto the altar cloth, spreading in the shape of a hand that reached outward, reaching for me. I wanted to stop, to close the book, to silence my voice, but the words poured from my mouth against my will, each one a poison. I realized then the crucifix was no longer content to judge lies. It wanted to rewrite truth. At the final verse, the congregation screamed as one, a sound that split heaven from earth. Some swore later they saw the Christ figure turn its head, eyes open, glaring at us all. The Mass ended in chaos. People stumbled out into the daylight, sobbing, crossing themselves furiously. But I remained, staring at the crucifix. And in that trembling silence, one thought consumed me. If the word itself could be corrupted, then what hope was left for the rest of us? Episode 10. The Grave That Opened. The night after the unholy Mass, no one in the village slept. Mothers clutched their children as though even dreams could betray them. Men muttered prayers through clenched teeth, their faith shaken into fragments. And me, I walked the cemetery alone, lantern in hand, unable to breathe within the chapel's walls any longer. The moon hung low, pale as bone, illuminating rows of crooked headstones. The air smelled of damp earth, heavy and expectant. I told myself I had come to pray for the dead, but deep down, I knew I was seeking answers the living could not give. That was when I heard it, a dull thud, faint but steady, like something knocking from beneath the ground. I froze, lantern trembling in my grip. The sound came again, harder this time. A grave at the far end of the yard shuddered, its soil breaking apart in ripples. My heart hammered. Graves did not move. Graves did not knock. I stumbled closer, drawn against my will. The name carved on the stone was so weathered it was almost unreadable. But one word remained clear: Sanctus, holy. Then, with a muffled roar, the earth split open. The soil heaved upward, spilling stones and roots. The grave cracked wide like a mouth gasping for air. I staggered back, lantern light swinging wildly. But there was no body inside. Instead, resting in the hollow earth was a book. Its leather cover was brittle, eaten by time, yet its pages glowed faintly, as if lit from within. My hands shook as I lifted it, dirt falling away like ash. Across the first page was scrawled a single phrase in ink the color of dried blood. "Beware the crucifix of judgment." The words burned into my vision, heavy as prophecy. I turned the page, and more writing revealed itself. Accounts of a relic cursed to tremble at deceit, to feed upon the sins of men. It spoke of villages abandoned, priests driven mad, congregations torn apart by secrets dragged into the light. Each story ended the same: ruin. The book described the crucifix not as a relic of God, but as a snare forged in silence, a mirror meant to break those who gaze too long. It does not expose lies to save souls, the warning read. It exposes them to claim them. My throat tightened. The lantern flickered, shadows bending toward me like hungry fingers. Then, from the open grave, a voice whispered, not with sound, but inside my skull, "You cannot bury truth, you can only bury yourself." The lantern slipped from my hand and shattered. Darkness rushed in, thick as pitch. I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest, and in that blackness I heard the crucifix screaming from the chapel once more, though I was half a mile away. The grave had not opened to release the dead. It had opened to remind me that the crucifix was never meant to stay buried. And now, neither was I. Episode 11. The Council of Lies. They arrived at dawn, 4 men in black robes, their crucifixes gleaming in the cold light. Messengers of the church, summoned by whispers that spread faster than fire. A parish possessed, a relic that screamed, a priest who had lost control of his flock. They called themselves a council, though to me they felt more like executioners. I welcomed them into the chapel with trembling hands. The crucifix still hung above the altar, fractured but alive, vibrating faintly as if anticipating their presence. The men carried with them an air of absolute certainty, the kind of faith that does not bend, only breaks. "Father Elias," said their leader, a sharp-eyed man named Cardinal Varus, "we are here to determine truth. What you claim, a relic that exposes lies, is dangerous heresy if false. The people must be calmed." I wanted to tell him that the crucifix did not need my claims to prove itself, but his words already tasted of deceit. We began in silence, the council kneeling in prayer. I stood aside, clutching the ancient book I had unearthed from the grave. Though I dared not open it before them, the crucifix trembled faintly, then stronger, rattling against the wall. The council pretended not to notice. "Father," Varus said at last, his voice calm, "did you tamper with this relic?" "No," I answered. The crucifix remained still. "Have you incited your people with false miracles?" "No." Silence again. His eyes narrowed. "Then tell us, did you invent these screams?" Before I could answer, the crucifix convulsed violently, shaking so hard the chains snapped free. It fell to the ground, shattering the floor with a crack. Gasps filled the air as the figure of Christ twitched in spasms. The council recoiled, their prayers stuttering into silence. Varus pressed his crucifix to his lips and whispered, "Trickery, nothing more." The relic responded instantly. It trembled, not faintly, but with a fury that shook the pews. From its cracks, a hiss rose, thousands of voices whispering, "Lie, lie, lie." The other three men turned toward Varus, eyes wide, his face flushed crimson. "Do not listen," he barked. "This is deception. I have served God with pure heart." The crucifix shrieked. The sound tore through the chapel, ripping his words to tatters. Varus staggered, his composure crumbling. "Stop this!" one of the others cried, though his voice quaked with terror. "This is no relic of Christ. This is blasphemy." And yet, as he spoke, the crucifix twitched again. Lie. Their piety cracked like glass. One admitted to secret bribes. Another whispered of sins cloaked in confession. Each denial sent the crucifix into violent spasms until their mouths, trembling with fear, spilled truths they had sworn never to utter. I watched as holy men collapsed to their knees, their faces pale, their faith shredded. For years they had judged others. Now, judgment had come for them. And as their confessions bled into the air, I knew that. Episode 12. The night Elias lied to himself. The council had fled by dusk, leaving behind only their shame and the echo of their broken prayers. But I remained. I always remained. That night, the chapel was mine alone. The crucifix lay upon the altar, cracked and trembling, its shadow stretching long and jagged across the stone floor. I lit no candles. I wanted no light. The darkness felt more honest. For hours I stared at it, daring it to move. My chest heaved with every breath, but I forced myself into silence. If it wanted confession, it would not take it from me so easily. Then, in the stillness, I whispered to myself, "I still believe." The crucifix shuddered violently. I clenched my jaw. I believe in God." The wood rattled harder, its broken arms twitching like a body in convulsion. The air thickened, heavy with the sour taste of iron. The pews groaned as though unseen hands pressed against them. "No," I spat, rising to my feet, fury burning through my veins. "I do believe. My whole life has been service to him. Every sermon, every confession." The crucifix convulsed so fiercely that the altar cloth tore beneath it. From its cracks spilled a pale, dust-like ash that swirled into the air. Whispers filled the chapel, dozens of voices layered into one. "Lie, lie, lie." I pressed my hands over my ears, tears burning my eyes. My voice broke into a ragged cry. "Then what am I, if not a servant of God? What am I?" The crucifix stilled. Silence. But it was not mercy. It was a silence that listened, that waited, that demanded. I fell to my knees, my strength gone. My hands shook as I dragged my journal toward me, the journal where I recorded sermons, prayers, hollow reflections meant to inspire others but never myself. The page before me was blank, and I wrote, "I no longer believe." The moment the words were inked, the crucifix released a long, guttural sigh, as though the weight of centuries had been lifted from its wooden chest. The sound echoed through the rafters like wind through a crypt. I stared at the words, unable to breathe. They were mine, yet they felt foreign, monstrous. In that instant, I realized I had lied not only to my parish, not only to God, but to myself. and the crucifix had forced the truth into my hands. The ash in the air settled onto the page, staining the ink darker, sealing it like a covenant. My confession was not private anymore. It belonged to the relic now. The chapel pulsed with an invisible heartbeat. The shadows thickened, stretching toward me as if in recognition. I whispered, barely audible, "What will you make of me now?" The crucifix trembled once more, slowly this time, almost like approval. And I understood. My faith had died that night, but the crucifix had only just begun to live. Episode 13, The Crucifix That Wouldn't Stop. It began at dawn. I woke to the sound of wood rattling against stone, faint at first, like teeth chattering in the cold. When I staggered into the chapel, the crucifix was already trembling on the altar. Not the violent spasms of before, but a ceaseless shiver, steady, relentless, as if the earth itself quaked beneath it. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed. No one had spoken, no lies had been told, and yet it would not stop. By midday, the villagers gathered outside the chapel. They claimed they could hear it from the square, the dull, rhythmic rattle echoing through the stones. Mothers covered their children's ears, but the sound seeped into every wall, every bone. It was no longer a secret miracle. It was a plague of noise. Inside, I tried everything. I prayed until my throat burned. I shouted the truth aloud, confessions upon confessions, of my doubt, my weakness, my hidden sins. But nothing silenced it. The crucifix only shook harder, its broken arms blurring with emotion, its shadow twitching like a living thing on the wall. By nightfall, the entire village refused to sleep. Doors slammed, windows barred, but the trembling was everywhere, in the ground, in the rafters, even in their own beds. It was not only sound, it was a rhythm, a pulse, burrowing into their skulls. Then came the visions. One by one, people reported dreams that bled into waking. A husband confessed he saw his wife's betrayal painted on the walls. Children screamed of secrets they should never have known, whispering their parents' sins with voices far too old for their mouths. The crucifix was no longer waiting for lies. It was dragging them into daylight, and still it would not stop. I pressed my hand to it once, desperate. The wood felt alive beneath my palm, vibrating like a heart too large for its chest. The whispers poured into me, faster than thought, louder than screams. A cacophony of every falsehood spoken, every deceit buried, every unholy silence across generations. It was not trembling at a single lie anymore. It was trembling at all of them. The weight of it crushed me. My knees buckled and I collapsed to the floor. Through blurred vision, I saw blood seeping from my nose, my ears, dripping onto the stones. Yet the crucifix pulsed on, tireless, unyielding. I understood then what the book from the grave had tried to warn. The crucifix was never a relic of salvation. It was a vessel of judgment, feeding on deceit until it no longer needed lies to sustain itself. By midnight, the villagers pounded at the chapel doors, screaming for me to end it, to burn it, to bury it once more. But I knew the truth with a clarity sharper than any blade. This crucifix would never stop, not until it had devoured every hidden truth in the world. And God help us, perhaps not even then. Episode 14, The Last Sermon. The church was full again, but not with reverence. The people came because they were desperate, half mad from nights without sleep, from dreams that bled their secrets into the open. Their eyes burned with terror, their lips pressed tight as though afraid that even breathing might betray them. They demanded I speak, they demanded I end it. I climbed the pulpit as though climbing a gallows. The crucifix still trembled above the altar, its constant shiver louder than my heartbeat. Every villager stared at me with raw expectation, as though salvation balanced on my tongue. I opened the gospel. The words swam on the page, twisting, writhing like serpents. I had no sermon prepared. What could I possibly say when truth itself had become poison? Brothers and sisters, I began, my voice thin. The Lord tests us with suffering, but He never abandons us. The crucifix quivered violently, rattling so loud the first row gasped. I tried again. If we pray together, He will silence this curse. The crucifix convulsed, slamming against the wall, shaking dust from the rafters. Mothers clutched their children. Men shouted for me to stop. The truth pressed against my throat, demanding release. I gripped the pulpit so hard my knuckles split. My voice dropped to a whisper. I cannot promise you deliverance. I cannot promise you peace. I cannot even promise you God. The crucifix stilled. The silence that followed was unbearable. Dozens of faces stared at me, horrified, disbelieving. I saw my ruin reflected in their eyes. A priest who had admitted before his flock that he no longer believed. But something darker rose inside me, something like defiance. I lifted my hands. Do you not see? The crucifix has shown us what we truly are. We are liars, every one of us, and we cannot live under the weight of our own falsehoods anymore. The crucifix pulsed, a slow, steady rhythm, almost like agreement. Cries erupted from the pews. Some begged me to stop. Others demanded I finish. The weight of choice pressed on me like a blade at my throat. If I lied, told them God would save us, perhaps they would cling to hope. Perhaps the crucifix would tremble itself into silence. If I told the truth, that faith was gone, that we were already condemned, it would destroy everything. I swallowed hard. My chest burned. The words tore free. There will be no miracle. There will be no salvation. Only this crucifix, and the truths it drags into the light. The crucifix exploded with sound, a roar that shook the stones loose, a scream that shattered stained glass into a rain of shards. The people fell to the floor, wailing, covering their ears, and I stood at the pulpit, my voice drowned in the storm, knowing I had given them not a sermon, but a death sentence. The last sermon. Episode 15. The silence after the tremor. When the crucifix finally shattered, the sound was unlike any scream I had ever heard. It was not the howl of wood breaking, nor the shriek of nails snapping free. It was the sound of every voice it had ever swallowed, every lie, every confession, every secret pouring out at once. And then, silence. A silence so vast it felt alive. It pressed against my skin, filled my lungs, made the chapel feel endless and empty all at once. I opened my eyes to ruin. The altar lay in splinters, the pews overturned, the stained glass windows blown inward like fragile bones. Villagers huddled together on the floor, clutching one another in terrified awe. No one spoke, no one dared. At the center of it all, the crucifix lay broken beyond repair. Its wooden Christ had split into fragments, the face unrecognizable, the arms scattered like kindling. But even in pieces, it seemed to breathe with the memory of trembling. I approached slowly, each step echoing in the hollow silence. My chest ached, my ears rang, but I bent and touched the largest fragment. Cold, still. It was over, or so I wanted to believe. I looked at my people, their eyes red, their lips trembling, their bodies hunched in shame. The crucifix was gone, but its work remained. Every secret it had dragged from the shadows now lived between us. Husbands who had betrayed, wives who had deceived, children who had spoken truths never meant to be heard. All of them bore wounds that no silence could heal. And me, I was no longer their priest. I had confessed the deepest blasphemy of all. I had admitted my unbelief, torn the mask from my own face. They looked at me not as a shepherd, but as a man exposed, broken, no holier than they. I lifted the fragment high. For a heartbeat, I considered burning it, scattering its ashes into the river. But a darker thought gnawed at me. Perhaps silence was worse. Perhaps the world needed the tremor, the scream, the judgment, because without it, what would stop us from lying again? I dropped the fragment. The silence swallowed the sound. The villagers began to leave one by one, their heads bowed, their whispers tight and nervous. They did not thank me. They did not curse me. They simply abandoned the chapel, as though afraid that even silence could betray them now. And I was left alone, standing amid the wreckage. I should have prayed. I should have begged God for forgiveness, but the words would not come. For the first time, I felt no tremor when I lied to myself, no relic to shudder, no wood to scream. Only me. And that perhaps was the greatest terror of all, because the crucifix did not tremble anymore. I did.
Epilogue: The splinter that still breathed. 4 weeks. The chapel stood abandoned. Dust settled on the pews. Ivy crept through the broken windows. And silence reigned where once the crucifix had screamed. Villagers refused to enter. They whispered that the curse had ended, that the relic was gone. But I remained. Each night I wandered the ruins with a lantern, staring at the shattered altar, the broken pieces of wood scattered like bones. I told myself I stayed to guard it, to ensure no one touched what was left. But the truth was simpler, darker. I couldn't leave. The silence wasn't peace, it was a weight. pressing deeper every night. Then one evening, as I gathered the fragments into a sack, I felt it. A splinter, no bigger than a finger, pulsed in my hand. I froze, lantern light trembling with me. The fragment quivered once, twice, like a heartbeat. My skin burned where it touched me, as though it recognized my blood. I dropped it instantly, but the damage was done. The silence around me shifted. It wasn't silence at all, it was listening. I bent closer. The splinter lay still, yet faint whispers coiled into my ears, softer than breath, sharper than blades. One lie is enough. I staggered back. My pulse thundered. 4 days. I tried to bury the fragment beneath stones, but every morning it reappeared on the altar, waiting. I tried burning it, but the fire smothered itself, leaving only smoke that curled into words I could almost read. The crucifix was gone, but its essence remained, not in the whole, but in the pieces. And each piece remembered. I began hearing the villagers again, not their voices, but their sins. At the well, at the market, in the hush of night, secrets pressed against my skull, demanding release. My own heart trembled worse than the crucifix ever had. Every thought I hid, every fear I buried, it all echoed inside me until I could no longer tell if the whispers came from the splinter or from me. One night, I found myself carving. My hands moved without will, shaping wood, fitting fragments together. The crucifix was not whole, not yet, but piece by piece. I was rebuilding what I had sworn to destroy. And in the shadows of the chapel, I heard a laugh. Low, hollow, endless. The villagers think the curse has ended. They sleep now, their doors unbarred, their prayers softer, their lies returning. But I know the truth. The crucifix does not need to be whole to tremble. It only needs to live, and it already does. Somewhere, in the blackness of the chapel, the smallest splinter shivers, and with it, so do I.